Good morning. It is 9:30 and time to resume the hearings for the examination of the Greater Norwich local plan. This would be a good time to switch mobile phones off or to turn them onto silent. Can I just check, can everyone hear me okay? Good. My name is Thomas Hatfield. I've been appointed by the Secretary of State, along with Mike Warden, to hold this examination and to produce reports of our conclusions and recommendations with regard to soundness. The Programme Officer for the examination is Annette Feeney, who you are likely to already have had contact with. Outside of the hearing sessions, any contact you make should be through Annette. This morning's session relates to matter 12 and will continue the issues we discussed yesterday relating to sites with extant planning permission, including those where an uplift is proposed. It's not my intention today to cover matters that have already been discussed in the first 2 weeks of the hearings. Instead, the discussion will focus primarily on the site allocations themselves. As previously stated, we will not be considering the merits of mission sites during the examination. Our guidance note outlines the procedures to be followed at the hearing sessions. This morning's session will run from 9:30 to around 1 o'clock, with a short break taken midway through. The hearings will be in the form of a structured discussion, which I shall lead. The agenda will follow the matters, issues and questions that have already been published. The purpose of the hearings is not to cover all matters or concerns that have been raised, as we are already aware of these from the written submissions. The hearings are for us to explore certain matters further to help us come to our conclusions. There are some issues where we already have sufficient information from the written statements, so there will be little or no discussion on those matters. Please bear this in mind. If you wish to speak on a certain matter, please use the raise hand function on the toolbar and I will come to you at an appropriate time. Can I also ask that participants please give their name and any organisation they represent before speaking for the first time. That will assist me and those watching the sessions online. Finally, I understand there's still a potential issue with the online streaming today. So Annette is recording the session in Teams as a backup in case we need to upload that later. However, if that recording is not needed, it will be deleted in accordance with data protection regulations. Okay, we made good progress yesterday and covered all of the sites in Norwich, which according to my list is sites A to N, which means the next sites to consider are those on the urban fringe, and we'll take them in the order in which they appear in the MIQ document. Okay, so that means the next site is site O on the MIQ list, which is local plan ref GNLP 0307/GNLP 0327, which is land north of the A11 in Cringleford. Before we start discussion on this site, I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that the partnership has published a series of proposed modifications to the site-specific policy, which are available on the examination library. I will discuss those in a short while when we get to the part of the discussion relating to the detailed wording of the policy itself. Okay, just to start the discussion, a question for the partnership, please. How has the proposed uplift of 410 dwellings at this site been arrived at? And why was this figure increased between Regulation 18 and Regulation 19 stages of the plan? Thank you. You're on mute, Mr. Burrell.
All right, sorry, I'm mute, yeah. Thank you, sir. So this, the 410 was identified as a result of work to, first of all, discount those areas of the site that wouldn't be developable. So that primarily is the bypass exclusion zone, which is in the Cringleford neighbourhood plan, but also includes the adult and older children's open space required under the section 106 for the Barrett site to the north, the northern part of GNLP 0307. This is rather complicated, so please stop me if it's not clear which parts of the site I'm referring to, because the uplift to 410 homes only applies to the southern part of GNLP 0307 and to GNLP 0327. The northern part already has permission as being is being developed. So return to identifying why that figure. So also it had to discount the amount of land that's required for a larger primary school that will now be needed with this uplift of 410 homes. And that then leads to a developable area, a net area of 16.25 hectares. At 25 dwellings per hectare, that comes out at 410 dwellings. The reason it was increased from Reg 18 to Reg 19 was that further discussions had been had between the site promoters and DM officers, and that enabled us to refine the earlier calculations that led to the 360, I think was the initial Reg 18 uplift that was consulted on.
Okay, so as I understand it then, is it the case that there was a capacity identified in the neighbourhood plan for this site, and the majority of that capacity has already been met by the extant planning permissions? Is that the case?
Yeah, so
presumably because it came forward at a higher density than was originally envisaged. Is that the case?
That is the case. The policy in the neighbourhood plan covered a far wider area. 1,300 homes are being granted permission on the majority of that area, but this is the remaining area. 1,300 homes were granted permission at higher density than was anticipated through the Cringleford neighbourhood plan.
Okay, and so the uplift in effect applies to the part of the site without planning permission at present?
That's right, the remaining part of the site. So that's southern part of GNLP 0307 and the whole of GNLP 0327.
Okay, and I can see from the aerial images that there's wider areas under construction, which presumably comprise the original allocation.
That's right, they're both south of the A11 and north of the A11, an area of land next to Roundhouse Way, the link road that's been in for a number of years now.
Okay, that's helpful clarification. Thank you. It's been put to me by the site promoter that the uplift should be higher and nearer to 500 dwellings. What's the partnership's response to that?
We don't think that is necessary. We feel that the uplift to 410 is appropriate based on the explanation I just gave you.
Okay, Mr. Durant, it was your point I've just put to the partnership. Did you wish to come back on it?
Yes, please. Yes, Edward Durant from Pegasus Group on behalf of Barrett David Wilson Homes. At the regulation stage, we submitted on behalf of our clients a vision document and a framework plan for the site, which is in their control, which is only 0307. So they don't control the adjacent sliver of land, which is 0327. Now, in that framework plan that we produced, we obviously took into account all of the necessary requirements that would be necessary to create a successful development in terms of public open space. We accounted for the increased area for the primary school site as well, taking into account buffer from the A47, water attenuation features, public open space, etc. And as a result of that, we came to a figure of approximately 500 dwellings. Now, what we did is we used the densities that were approved on the extant planning permission for 650 dwellings to the north of the allocation, which is presently being built out. So our concern is that by constraining the allocation, which actually covers an area of land larger than our clients' land, then actually we won't be bringing forward dwellings at an appropriate density, and actually that density may fall below the densities that are listed in policy 2 of the submission local plan, and clearly that wouldn't be the most appropriate use of a site on the edge of Norwich, which is already deemed to be a sustainable location.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wang, you've got your hand raised. Do you wish to come in? Sorry, Mr. Wang, you're on mute still.
Thank you. Sorry. Yes, I just wanted some clarification of exactly what the extant sites are here, because as far as I'm aware, and according to the developer's own response, GNLP 0327 has no planning permission on it, at all, whereas 0307 does have planning permission. So the uplift essentially applies to only one site at the moment. On top of that, there is also another site that has outline planning permission, which is for the reserve site for the school. So I'd like some clarity. This isn't the reserve site on 0307, it's the reserve site on Tilia's development to the west of Roundhouse Way. So I'd like to know exactly which sites this uplift applies to, all right, in the first instance, and why, just because the sites are there, they have to be developed to their full extent. To my mind, the development number should be based on need, and we, looking at the actual population statistics, would argue that this number should be lower. And at a minimum, it should be capped, all right? I understand that Pegasus Group, on behalf of the developers, want the number to be open-ended and for 410 to represent a minimum. We think that's an appalling situation to be in, and we would like to see the policy clarified and altered to cap the number of homes in the area, because it's already been exceeded. I know the developers and the GNLP have argued that the Cringleford Neighbourhood Plan expires in 2026, and therefore development can be initiated yet again on any site that's available. But that is not the case. The neighbourhood plan identified the total number of houses to be built in the remaining land in Cringleford. That's all the land. Okay, it didn't expire in 2026. It was the number that was capped at 1,200, and that has already been exceeded. And now we are being asked to take another 410, possibly even more, according to the developers, just because the land is there and they can cram on as many houses as they wish according to their calculations. So I'd like, firstly, clarification on what the uplift applies to, and secondly, which sites the uplift, which sites the uplift applies to, and whether, if this uplift goes ahead, the remaining sites will not be developed, therefore. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wine. Just before I go back to the partnership for response, just so I understand your position, is your position in effect that once the figure of 1,200 for the wider allocation is achieved, then the rest of the site should remain undeveloped? Is that your position?
That was our position in 2014, and it remains our position, although we understand that initially site 0307, the developers wanted 800 on that, and there is space for that number. So we would tolerate an uplift of 150 on that site. We would also tolerate housing being placed on the reserve site owned by a different developer. Because the school is coming forward now, it's already been designed, the reserve site, which is between what we call Keir North and Keir South, developments on the west of Roundhouse Way, is scheduled for about 50 dwellings. So we would want to see a cap, an overall cap of 200 houses. So we're not against development, we're against overdevelopment. And we feel what Pegasus are demanding, which firstly is totally inappropriate to have just a minimum number of build. That means you can have carte blanche to cover anything with housing. We would like to see the policy have in it no more than 200 homes, but we would also like to see written into the policy and clarified that the Southern Bypass Protection Zone is guaranteed as protected alongside the Cringleford development boundary, because the developers have called our boundary arbitrary, despite it having been agreed by all our parishioners. And we just find those statements quite unpleasant and quite appalling, that they should try and override our development boundary in this way. So we want a cap on the number of houses that is about half of what is being proposed, and we want guarantees for the Southern Bypass Protection Zone, and we don't see them in this policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wang. Just for the partnership, I think we'll come back to the issue of the bypass, or the land adjoining the bypass, and I'm aware that the settlement boundary reflects that at present. We'll come back to that later, but if we could have a response from the partnership on the request for clarifications from Mr. Wang and the points by Mr. Wang and Mr. Durant about what the policy should specify in terms of the number of dwellings. Obviously, at present, it's framed as approximately, and you've heard arguments there for both a cap and for a minimum figure. So response to those points, please. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So in terms of the uplift, this is what I was referring to earlier. The uplift applies to GNLP 0307, but not the area that already has planning permission. So on the plan in the sites allocation plan, page 201, that is the area that is north of the electricity pylons, and it's shown with a yellow diagonal lines under the pink surface wash. So that is the area that has permission for 650 homes and is not part of the uplift. The uplift does not apply to that area. The uplift applies to the area southwest of the pylons. So that's the remainder of GNLP 0307 and GNLP 0327. I think there is a small amount of land, a small wedge of land that goes north of the pylons, which is identified for, moving on to Mr. Wang's second point, for the school. So the school is in GNLP 0307. Primary school will be to the north of the pylons, to the north of that area, and there'll be an area to the west of that for an extension to the school, which will be required as a result of this extra housing. I don't think there's anything else that I need to add in response to Mr. Wang's questions, but
just so I'm 100% clear, Mr. Burrell, yeah, before you move on to the point about what the figure should specify, I'm looking at that map you directed me to on page 201. And there's the purple settlement boundary on the southern west fringe. Presumably that's reflecting the buffer zone we've just been discussing.
Yeah, so the buffer zone. Sorry.
The northeast of that, there's a dashed line that crosses the site. Presumably that's the pylons.
That is, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And so, but that's helpful clarification from my perspective. So then the remaining question is the one of what should the 2 points you've heard with regards to the number specified in the policy.
We're happy with the policy as drafted, as redrafted. So that includes a 410 uplift that was included in the Reg 19 and consulted on as 360, I think it was, at Reg 18.
And what's your response to the arguments that it should be either a cap or a minimum figure?
Well, we seek to retain the wording of approximately that we have in the policy. This provides guidance for future planning applications, so it acts as as a guide to how many homes should be provided in the future.
Okay. Okay. Mr. Durant, did you wish to come back?
Yeah. Yes, sorry, just to say that our client has already had a good working relationship with Cringleford Parish Council, and they continue to work kind of collaboratively with the Parish Council. I wouldn't want any of our language in any of our representations to affect that working relationship. We kind of strongly kind of recognise the views of the Parish Council. What we would say is that often the use of these figures, although they have approximately with them, and the original figure in the neighbourhood plan allocation also had approximately next to it, it does generate a consensus locally that is the figure that will be delivered. And then the problem our clients have and other clients are that when we want to exceed that figure and we stick within the kind of realms of what we consider to be approximately, we come into conflict at the planning application stage. So that is one of the reasons why we're submitting this representation. But fundamentally, we still believe, as a result of the master planning work that we've carried out, that we'd be delivering at such lower densities if there were to be a cap and only 150 dwellings on the site, that the densities would fall way below those that are listed in policy 2 of the submission local plan. And ultimately, policy 2 of the local plan is all about achieving sustainable location in sustainable development in sustainable locations. We're here on kind of one of the urban fringes of Norwich City, and based on some of the conversations that have been had on other policies and other sites that are coming forward with or without planning permission, there is clearly a need to maximise the development potential of sites where they are in sustainable locations, where you already have a developer on site and delivering to what are already considered to be acceptable densities within the village. So all that we're asking is that the policy be made more flexible to ensure that when the planning application comes forward, that our client isn't held to a specific number that is, or a number that is below which they believe is achievable, purely because that is the one listed in the local plan. We recognise the use of approximately gives that flexibility, but we feel that the number needs to be increased.
You're on mute, sir.
Sorry. You mentioned, Mr. Durant, that you were concerned about how that might be interpreted at application stage. Are you concerned that approximately is too? Does it imply that 410 is the figure not to be? Do you not feel that gives enough flexibility with regards to the figure that's listed?
It does for our purposes, but we've already seen with the neighbourhood plan allocation that also had the word approximately in it, and some of the representations that were received for additional dwellings on the site have, obviously from third parties, have kind of considered that figure to be a cap. And our concern is that the 410 figure would then consider to be a cap. And if the adjacent land parcel were to come forward, 0327, then independently, because that's not controlled by our client, then that would further reduce the number of dwellings that could be built by our client and already accessed off a successful development that already has kind of vehicular access onto Colney Lane to the north.
Okay, Mr. Wang.
Thank you, Inspector. Yeah, our concern is exactly the same as Pegasus on behalf of their client, but completely the opposite. I'm afraid that because we know that there are going to be more houses built than on the site in question, and because it appears that the GNLP is unaware of a second site for the school on Tilia Keir's land, which will no doubt come forward for housing, and no doubt GNLP 0327, even though it's not extant at the moment, they will come forward and ask for housing. This could push up the housing level to horrendous numbers. Potentially the uplift could get to more than 1,000. And Cringleford's population has rocketed since the last census. It's now around 5,000 with nearly 2,500 homes. Adding another on top of that will be so deleterious to the area as to be unbelievable. And the GNLP quite rightly said there's got to be a transport analysis for this area. But essentially, the sites all lead onto one single road. The Thickthorn improvements, to which we've lost land to already, and we'd like to get some of our green space back because of that. The Thickthorn improvements do not help this site. All these houses and all the vehicular movements will empty out onto Colney Lane. And that's a red route. It's an ambulance route. Okay. And I just do not think we can sustain the level of development in Cringleford that the developers would like us to have. We're not against having more houses on those sites. It's just that the policy is so unclear as to how many houses that Cringleford will end up with that we feel we have to have some form of cap. I know that developers don't like caps. I know they don't like approximate. Approximate was criticised yesterday by your fellow inspector because it was such an inaccurate figure and people were putting 30% on top of approximate values. So it's absolutely crazy. The improvements to Colney Lane with all these houses is just a roundabout. It won't help the ambulances at all. So my feeling is that we have to have a cap for the number of houses in Cringleford. Just because those sites are available doesn't mean to say we have to build on them. There are environmental considerations to be held here too. We want our wildlife corridors preserved. We want to ensure that the A47 Southern Bypass Protection Zone is preserved. And I understand you're going to talk about that in a minute, so I won't say any more about that. But we do not feel that the projections made by the GNLP on a population basis warrant the number of houses that they are proposing. I know you can get them in. I know you can get appropriate densities, but we just do not feel that that number is appropriate, given that we know there are some more houses coming forward already. And the other developers are not going to like them all going on to 0307. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wang. Mr. Warden, did you wish to come in?
Thank you, Mr. Hatfield. Just to the avoidance of any doubts, or just to make it clear, I didn't criticise the use of the word approximately yesterday. I questioned the word approximately in relation to the Reetham site, with whether 141 could be considered approximately 100. That was a question for the partnership. I've not criticised the use of approximately or in the region of. I just wanted to make that clear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we've heard a lot about the numbers, about what numbers should be specified, whether that should be a minimum, whether that should be a cap, whether 410 is appropriate, or whether it should be a higher or lower figure. So I want to move on from that now, because I think I've got all I need on that specific point. I'll allow the partnership a very brief final word before we do move on, if it wishes to make a final comment.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Just in response to Mr. Wang's comments, we are aware of the school not being required on the Tillier site and being required instead on this site, which is in line with the Cringleford neighbourhood plan. Wildlife corridors, we're going to be talking about the bypass protection zone. Wildlife corridors, they're a requirement of any planning application, and as is indeed biodiversity net gain through this plan. So just like to reassure Mr. Wang that that is part of the overall plan policy approach.
Okay, and for my benefit, the Tillier site, is that the site that already has consent?
Yes, that's the site that's sort of the long slither of land that goes next to Roundhouse Way, and there was an area that was identified for a primary school on that land. It's no longer required. No planning application has been received, but it is approximately, it's 1 hectare of land. So if a plan application were submitted on that, they would have to be considered.
And that's not included in your density assumptions for the 410 then?
No, it's not part of that site. No.
Okay.
It's on the plan. It's the area that's shown as 2018/2404 in yellow. It's between that and 2018/2836 in yellow, the yellow diagonal lines.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Okay, and I think the point that Mr. Wang was making then, if I understand it correctly, is that in effect it's 410 plus whatever comes forward on that site, as I understand it, and therefore the figure isn't really 410, it's 410 with an as yet unknown addition to it.
It's 410 on the allocation, but that's an area with existing permission. So overall in Cringleford, indeed, if a plan application came in, that would lead to an increase if it's at 25 per hectare of 25 extra homes.
Oh, but the point you're making is that it's outside of this allocation and therefore not
referenced
in this allocation policy. Okay,
that's right.
That's helpful clarification. Okay, I'm going to move on to the point that was raised before about highway impacts, because obviously 410, potentially a higher figure, is a significant number. And how confident are the partnership that could be safely accommodated within the local road network? Thank you.
Well, we have had Norfolk County Council have looked at this, and they are confident that it can be accommodated in the road network. There is a proposed modification to the policy in relation to access, which would you like to discuss that now, sir, or when we get on to the actual?
If it relates to the point that you're making, Mr. Burrell, just want to draw my attention to it. And
so in the proposed modifications that we submitted day before yesterday, so as Mr. Wang referred to, a transport assessment will be required. The second bullet we have amended so that it refers to connections to adjacent sites by all modes which support active travel where feasible. So that's in relation to walking, cycling and bus use.
Well, that's a more detailed point, really. I think the point that I was raising, and I think that was raised before, was about the wider road network. So, for example, Colney Lane and the junction with the A47.
Yes, well, this has been assessed by Norfolk County Council, and they're happy that this allocation can be taken forward. They're part of the partnership. They have been involved throughout in identifying capacity of sites.
Okay, Mr. Wang, I mean, I heard your concerns before. Did you wish to supplement them, seeing as we're discussing the matter?
Yeah. So the issue with this road from the A11 and the bus interchange is that this runs through to the hospital. It's the main route off the A11 up to the hospital. The developers have already responded to the planners by indicating that they are going to add to their main entrance a roundabout, which will help the traffic flows. The site has already been partly prepared for that, and that's the main entrance to their site. So we're now going to add another 410 homes, which are all going to disgorge onto that road. You've already heard that that number may be higher. In the morning, the traffic queues all the way back to the A11, or it did pre-COVID, I should say. It may not now. There are also other issues from the other end, which is all traffic light controlled. And we are concerned that the numbers are just getting too large for that road. The road can't be enlarged, unfortunately, because it is restricted by university land on one side, which is protected green space, and by the housing developments on the other side. So we are quite concerned. We are very pleased that the GNLP has removed the bus route through the estate, because all that does is recognise that it's already been removed from the estate, and that Pegasus, in their own presentation, did not want to have that built into the plan, and we fully agree with them. For safety reasons, buses should not go through these estates because where the housing is, it's quite high density and the roads are quite narrow. So our overall concern essentially is that there is going to become a time with all these houses disgorging onto that road and all the commuter traffic coming to the hospital that it will not be fit for purpose. And that's our main concern.
Okay, thank you. Okay, that's helpful. I will take a brief comment from Mr. Duran, but I do want to say it at this time, and I'm just mindful in terms of timekeeping how many sites we need to get through. And this isn't a comment that's directed at any particular individual, but I think it'd be helpful from now on in really if people keep their comments focused and to the point. And that's really just with the number of sites in mind that we need to get through. I mean, from my perspective, this was the site that probably had the most questions attached to it, so I'm not unduly concerned, but I think just to ensure we finish on time, it's I know to everyone in the session to keep comments short and focused. Thank you. Mr. Durant.
Yeah, sorry, a very quick comment. Just the fact that obviously the hospital is something that generates trips, and if these homes weren't built to this density in this location, then they would have to be built elsewhere in the Greater Norwich area, and so that traffic would inevitably still come along Colney Lane. Part of the kind of reason for allocating this site is that it offers opportunities for people to walk and cycle should they be employed in the vicinity, and therefore it's a great emphasis to increase the densities. So I'll just keep it short.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think I've got all I need on the issue of highways and transport. Does the partnership wish to make a brief final comment before we move on?
Just briefly to say that the second access is being provided to the hospital via Heatherset Lane, which may help to ameliorate the concerns there. And going back to the policy does state that improvements to Colney Lane are part of the requirement for the development.
Okay, thank you. Question with regards to the trajectory. As I understand it, the statement of common ground, well, the statement of common ground with this site is with Barrett David Wilson Homes, but they don't control site 0327, which doesn't currently benefit from planning permission. So what is an indication is there from the owners that this site will be developed in the timescales envisaged? It's a trajectory point, in effect.
Yes. So our trajectory, one moment. Our trajectory is for development from 2029-30 up to 2033-34. We have had a response from David Barrett Homes. We haven't had a response that I'm aware of from Code for Bullen developments. So therefore we've had to estimate the trajectory in relation to that element of the allocation. We've identified it as developable, obviously not as deliverable.
Okay, and it's owned by a house builder, to your knowledge?
Bullen Developments.
Developments. And the site can be accessed from adjoining sites. There's no issue in terms of any ransom strips or routes through are secured, are they?
To the Bullen Developments element?
Yes.
Yes, I believe so, yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I want to move now on to the detailed policy wording. So that's policy GNLP 0327 in the Part 2 sites plan. Sorry, it has both references, apologies, so 0307 and 0327. Part 2, the partnership have proposed to delete the requirement for a bus route, and that appears to accord with Mr. Wang's position, and Mr. Durant, you made reference to that effect in your representation. So presumably that accords with what everyone wishes to see on this site. Is that the case? Okay, fine. I also understand from the reps, I believe it was, to the Reg 19. Apologies. So sorry, I've just got lost in my notes. So the deletion of land for pedestrian footbridge, again, I understand that's due to an error.
Yes, that was an error. The pedestrian footbridge is to the south of the A11. There's an existing pedestrian footbridge that will have to be replaced as part of the National Highways A47 improvements. That should not have been in this policy.
Fine. In which case, add that to the list of main mods.
I put it in the document I submitted a couple of days ago, sir.
I've got that open in front of me, and I also see that 9 has been removed and presumably to the explanatory text, which obviously reflects the discussions we've had on previous sites.
That's correct.
Okay, that's fine. Are there any other comments on the suggestions put forward by the partnership on that document submitted, circulated a couple of days ago, in terms of the additions and deletions?
Could I just say, when you're talking about additions or deletions, are we talking about the number of homes then?
Well, there is a proposed change.
And the use of the word approximately.
We've got the word approximately there. Obviously, I'll reflect on that based on the discussion we've had. That's purely the other elements we've not previously discussed in there.
Yes. No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you.
Okay. The final point I wanted to discuss with regards to the policy wording, I think this cross relates to an issue that was raised earlier by Mr. Wang, was the issue about the buffer zone to the A47 to the southwest of the site, which obviously is reflected by the settlement boundary at present. That isn't specifically referenced in the policy wording itself, but there is a map which you've already drawn my attention to, Mr. Burrell, on page 201, which shows the allocation in red. It shows the settlement boundary in a dashed purple line, and there's a text box across the centre of the allocation which says uplift on existing commitment to 410 homes in brackets within settlement boundary. So I suppose the question is that a requirement for those 410 homes to be within the settlement boundary? Because if it is, it doesn't appear in the policy wording at present. And what is the status of what is the approach of the policy, I should say, to land alongside the A47, which, as I understand, reflects the neighbourhood plan allocation? Question for the partnership, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. The intention, and if it's not adequate, be very happy to consider amending the wording. It's number 4. Adequate landscaping green infrastructure will be provided, including a landscape buffer in accordance with the bypass protection zone adjacent to the A47. That is intended to cover that issue. Now, if it's required, if it needs a reference to the settlement boundary, I'd certainly be happy to add that.
Okay, and the settlement boundary reflects that buffer, doesn't it?
Yes, yes, and that's in the Cringlefield neighbourhood plan and was in previous South Norfolk planning documents.
Okay. Based on what we've just heard, are there any comments on part 4 of the policy from either Mr. Wang or Mr. Durant, or indeed anyone else?
Yes, I have a comment. Again, I apologise. This is language. The use of the term adequate landscaping and green infrastructure it essentially can be interpreted in many ways. What we would like is some form of guarantee to protect the southern bypass protection zone, because it's already started to be eroded around the hospital. And therefore we would like protection for that area to be guaranteed, and the boundary, the Cringlefield boundary as well. We would like guarantees on the protection of those 2 areas. So I would just like the language to be strengthened in paragraph in point 4. That's all.
Thank you. Mr. Durant, did you wish to come in?
Yeah, just to say that our master planning work has always taken into account respecting that buffer zone, and to a certain extent it also relates to a constraint in terms of noise and air quality adjacent to the A47. So it is always something that our client has sought to respect.
Okay, I understood from your statement and Reg 19 representation, Mr. Durant, that you wish to have text box I just referred to before on page 201 taken out of that plan. Is that how does that tally with what you've just said?
I think there was just some confusion about the wording in that text box that we just wanted clarified between the policy and I think there were two plans that involved from memory, and there was just, I need to look back at the representations we made, but I think it was just clarity on that point.
But you're content with the principle of excluding the land within the buffer zone outside of the settlement boundary from the allocation? Fine. If there's no disagreement on that point, I think I mean the settlement boundary shows very, very clearly in that location, including on that plan, where the buffer zone is. So I think for the purposes of clarity and in order to be effective, it might be helpful to strengthen the wording in point 4. It may simply need to refer to, I mean, it says, for example, it refers to in accordance with the bypass protection zone. It might simply just need to say, as shown by the settlement boundary in the plan on page 201. Words to that effect. Mr. Durant, did you wish to make a supplementary point?
No, I didn't, so I dropped my hand.
Okay. And I think that would clarify the wording, and it would make the position with regards to the A47 buffer zone crystal clear. So if I could ask the partnership to reflect on that, perhaps you'll think of better wording than I just can't off the top of my head.
I agree with your wording, and it's in principle. I said earlier we'd be very happy to make that change because it is just simply a clarification, and that was our intention.
Okay, that'll need to be a main mod though, because I think it's required.
Of course,
for
yeah.
clarity.
Yeah.
Okay. Any final comments on this site before we move on?
I just want to apologise, Inspector. I now have to rush off, so I can't stay online. All right. Thank you very much for your help and for everybody else, Pegasus and the GNLP. That's been a very helpful session. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Wang. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, we'll move on to site P now in the MIQ list, which is local plan ref HEL2. And that's land at the Royal Norwich Golf Club, either side of Drayton Road in Helsdon. It is Helsdon, isn't it?
It is, yes.
It was one of the ones listed in the very helpful website I found on pronouncing Norfolk place names.
Okay.
Okay, let me just call that up. Okay, a question for the partnership to start with. As I understand it, this site has outline consent for 1,000 dwellings and reserve matters consent for 95 dwellings, and that's from the Statement of Common Ground. At what stage are the other reserve matters applications on this site? Thank
you. This is being phase 1 and phase 2 are currently being developed. Reserve matters for phase 3 have been agreed. I don't know when the reserve matters for phases 4, 5 and 6 will be agreed, but I believe that, is it from Persimmon? No, I think there's somebody from Persimmon on the call. Oh, am I wrong? Sorry, so yeah, I don't know when the reserve matters will be completed for the later phases of development.
So phases 1, 2 and 3, which you said had reserve matters consent, does that account for the 95 dwellings in the Statement of Common Ground, or has there been a subsequent?
Yes, it does, yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Mr. Durant, your hand's raised. Is that from before, or is that in relation to this site?
It's not. Pegasus are also acting on behalf of Persimmon, but we're not attending. But it's just worth noting that we submitted a phase 3 reserve matters application last week.
Okay, thank you. And how many dwellings is that for, Mr. Durant?
138.
So that leads to a total of phases 1 to 3 of 386 dwellings.
386 was that, sorry?
Yes, phases 1 to 3. So Persimmon are then undertaking work to ascertain the likely numbers they may be able to achieve on phases 4 to 6. Now, there is an issue here. So in terms of the trajectory is for 962 dwellings, and it's difficult to know whether phases 4 to 6 will actually provide for that amount, the remaining amount of dwellings, 962 minus 386, but that's the information we've been given up to now.
And when you say it's difficult to know, does the densities that have been assumed so far imply there'll be a few numbers?
It depends on the working up of the plans on the drawings for those specific elements of the site.
Okay. Okay. So, and because those, I mean, obviously the position's moved on since the statement of common ground was agreed, because that referred to consent for 95. Mr. Durant, from your perspective, it's 2023 to 24 that the partnership are assuming that the next phases come on stream. Does that accord with your client's intentions?
We're only instructed at the moment on phase 3, but one of the issues is that a blanket tree preservation order has been served on the site during the determination of the second reserve matter application for phase 2. So that has had a significant impact on the delivery of the site and bringing forward the detailed designs.
Right, but there's permission now for nearly 400 units. Obviously, phase 1 is presumably the 95 that was mentioned in the original statement of common ground. I'm assuming, therefore, that phase 2 is what's assumed to be delivering from 23-24 onwards. Is that correct, Mr. Burrell?
I believe so, sir.
Okay. And that was consented presumably between the statement of common ground being agreed, which most of them were dated to last summer from memory.
That's right. And then, as you've just been told, there's just been that recent permission reserved matters application has been granted.
Okay, it's the same developer doing phases 2 and 3, or constructing phases 2 and 3, who constructed phase 1.
Yeah, yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay, fine. In which case, I'm content with the trajectory figure for that site. Just on the issue of tree preservation orders, is there a concern that might restrict the total number of sites that come forward on this allocation? Total number of dwellings, sorry, that should come forward on this allocation.
Yes, there is.
And to what extent could that affect the total numbers on this allocation?
I'm probably in a difficult position because I'm not instructed on the client to speak on this behalf. I just stayed on out of interest. But it has become a constraint with delivering the detailed reserve matters application for phase 3 that we've already seen it as quite a significant constraint when working on the detailed plans.
Okay. It's difficult without anything more in front of me than that, really, to come to a view on it. I mean, Mr. Burrell, could you provide perhaps a comment on this TPO issue and the effect that's likely to have on any delivery on this site, or is it impossible to say at this stage?
It's very difficult to say at this stage. I am aware of the TPO issue, and also surface water flow has been addressing surface water flows has been an issue as well, and I believe this is the reason why you have the gap in the trajectory you can see with without the delivery in the third year. Other than that, I'm afraid I don't have more to offer.
Okay. A couple of questions on the policy itself. Part 2 requires 2 hectares for education provision. Presumably that's accounted for in the outline consent, is it?
Yes, it is, yes.
Okay. Part 3 requires alternative golf course provision. Presumably that's been secured again through the outline consent.
Yes, well, there is an alternative golf course that's up and running, and it's much better facility than this facility is. Capable of holding international competitions, and that was the driver behind moving the golf club. That was unintentional.
That was a good one, even if it was unintentional. Okay, a final comment on this policy is, again, the issue with regards to minerals and waste, the signpost to the other DPD. If part 6 could be moved to the explanatory text.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, certainly do that.
Okay, any more comments on site HEL 2? Okay, we'll move on then to site letter Q in the MIQ list. Local plan reference EAS1, land south and east of Easton. Mr. Warden, apologies, and myself saw this site during our visits and saw that it was under construction. The trajectory assumes that part of the site with outline consent for 890 dwellings will deliver 40 dwellings in 21-22, with 80 dwellings per annum thereafter. How much of that part of the site has reserved matters consent?
Just turn to my notes, sir. Sorry. Please, could I ask Mr. Walker to present the information on this, please?
Yes, by all means.
Hello, sir. That's my. Am I visible now, sir?
Yes, I can
Yes.
see it here.
I'm just using the information provided to us by colleagues at South Norfolk District Council, Broadland, South Norfolk. So the updated information says reserve matters granted for 291 dwellings on phase 1, and the consent reference is 2020/0962, and that was consented on the 19th of March 2021. And then would you like any detail of further submissions, or is it just the consents that you're interested in, sir?
It's how they relate to the trajectory assumptions, really. So what I had from the hearing statements was that there was outline consent for 890 dwellings. But you're saying that site has reserved matters consent for a considerable number now, and presumably that's under construction at present. Is that the case?
That's correct, sir. Yes.
Okay. Ms. Razek, do you have a comment on this site?
No, sorry, I was going to assist you with the numbers if you hadn't been able to have them to hand, as I've been submitting the reserve matters consents on that site, but I think you've had answered. Thank you.
Okay, and presumably, Ms. Razek, well, I say presumably, do you recognise the figures the council are assuming in terms of 40 in the current financial year and then 80 thereafter? Does that accord with the assumptions of your client, to your understanding?
Yes, to my understanding, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. A couple of detailed points in relation to the site-specific policy itself. The partnership obviously has proposed a modification to reduce the capacity of the site from 1,044 to 954, reflecting that part of the site now has permission for the uses. Could that be added to the list of main modifications, please? And also, obviously, that will need to be taken into account in the trajectory assumptions. I'm aware, for example, yesterday there was talk of downward modifications on the figures to be assumed on a number of sites. So it's perhaps just a note that those are kept tally of, so that we can aggregate them together once the hearing sessions are over. But that's another, well, that appears to be 90 dwellings lost on this site. Okay.
Sorry, sir, I was muted. Could I just add that we have made a start on putting together a tally, and we'll do so.
Okay, thank you. Part 4 of the policy and this perhaps I'll just double check. There's a few part 4s, aren't there? I've just put part 4 in my notes. Give me a second to find it. Okay, I mean, it talks about the possible retention of this area as open space. That's the so it's the first part 4 under the heading master plan. It says careful consideration of development west of the allotments, including the possible retention of this area as open space. It's not clear to me what that means, possible retention as open space, and just whether that needs to be clearer. I mean, the area west of the allotments, when I was looking at this site yesterday on an aerial plan, appeared to relate to a kind of triangle on the western fringe of the site. Does that part of the site need to be left open? And if it does part 4 under the master plan heading need to be clearer? I just read that and thought, how is it clear so that it's obvious how a development proposal should respond to it? The use of the term possible really means it's optional and nice to have.
Yeah.
If you need that area being open for urban design purposes or as an approach to the village, then should it say something a bit stronger than possible retention? It's a question for you in the first instance.
Yes, we'll clarify that point and propose a modification based on that, because that, I agree, so that is not clear.
Okay, it depends what you want to achieve. Really. I'm not going to specify what it might say, because you might have something very specific in mind. But I think as currently worded, it does need clarifying for effectiveness.
Yes, agreed.
Okay. The introduction to the section headed transport, which is on page 212. It's the second page of the policy. This is a general point I wanted to make, and I think it'll apply to a few policies as we go through, and maybe even to some we've already been through that I haven't picked up. I don't think it can be a requirement of the development plan that transport and highway improvements are agreed with the county council as highway authority or the highways agency. The reason that is because you might have a situation where a developer on this site or another site disagrees with the opinion of the county council or the highways agency and wishes to challenge them at appeal. And in that situation, it would be contrary to the development plan by virtue of them not agreeing to it. Whereas in reality, what you're looking to achieve is, appropriate or whatever the terminology is, improvements to the highway network areas justified by the evidence, not a requirement for the highway authority to agree, because it then means that you could have a situation where, for example, an inspector could find that a highway proposal was appropriate despite having not been agreed with the highway authority, and therefore would have to find that the proposal was still contrary to the development plan despite being appropriate in highways terms because they hadn't agreed. It's a wider point. It's one I've made on other local plans, and I just think that's a tidying up exercise to apply here and to other policies throughout the plan. So it has broader implications at that point.
So that's noted, sir. We will reword that. Also, just noted that the highways agency don't exist anymore, do they? They're national highways now. So
it'd certainly be difficult to secure a body's agreement who doesn't exist. That's
exactly. Okay.
The point about 10 is the familiar point about the minerals and waste core strategy, moving to the explanatory text. Okay, final point on part 12, wastewater infrastructure capacity must be confirmed prior to development taking place. Does that imply that development can't take place until you have written agreement from the utilities provider? Is that what it's envisaged to be?
This is something that I believe England Water asked us to put in. And I'm not aware there's a particular issue with wastewater at this site, so I'd like to look at that in detail and see whether it's something that was requested by England Water, and if so, for what reason, and respond to you on that, sir, with a proposed made modification if it's necessary.
I mean, there's similar requirements have been included in some of the policies for some of the smaller sites we discussed last week. And they weren't phrased exactly like that, but it was a similar thrust. And I know the partnership suggested and we're amenable to a softening of the policy, because as currently worded, that almost lends itself to a condition. It says, prior to development taking place, and obviously, if you're writing a condition, it's no development shall take place until X, Y, or Z. Like I say, it's framed like a pre-commencement condition.
Okay, so the issue here.
The concern is not just a detailed one; it's more also a substantive one, because does that mean development can't happen until that issue is resolved, and how does that affect the trajectory?
No,
my understanding is there's a statutory duty for the utilities providers to allow a connection to take place. Appreciate there can be implications at the treatment works where there's insufficient capacity. I think with those issues in mind, I'd ask the partnership to perhaps have a think about that.
Yeah.
That wording. I'm not sure it's sound present, is what I'll say.
Okay. Yeah, my understanding is the same as yours. There is a requirement for Anglian Water to provide connections here, and this is not an area where there are specific issues to do with wastewater. So we will come back to you on that. I
think the suggestion elsewhere, I don't know what the partnership's view on that was, perhaps a requirement for a utility statement, but if you could reconsider that and come back to me with a modification, I'd appreciate that.
Yep.
Okay. Any other comments on the eastern site before we move on? Okay, in which case we'll move on to sites lettered R in the MIQs, local plan reference DRA1, which is land east of Cater Road and north of Hull Lane, Drayton. My understanding is that this site now benefits from outline consent. Have any reserve matters applications yet been submitted?
I haven't have an update on this. They are actually on site, so it has permission and is being developed. I have a revised trajectory for you, which is 22, 23, 56 homes, 23, 24, 45 homes, 24, 25, 60 homes, and 25, 26, 63 homes. Then the remaining 43 after 26. Now, I apologise for not having got this to you earlier, but this really is hot off the press. So that's a total of 267 homes. I drove past this recently. They are just beginning on site now.
I'm just give me a second to find it in the trajectory. Oh, it's not listed.
I found it difficult to find this one this morning as well. If I can be of assistance,
Mr. Walker.
It would be if you search for reference 20161066. That should take it to, and that is on page 1, 8th line up, I think. 9th line up, sorry. 9th line up on page 1. Land adjacent to Hall Lane School Road is referred to.
Okay, so it's in for 250 in the trajectory starting next financial year. So presumably, is it still starting next financial year from what you said, Mr. Burrell, just with slightly increased numbers?
Yes.
And what's the basis for the increased annual delivery rates?
Well, I assume they just finalised their plans for the site now that they're beginning on site as Hopkins Homes. Now that they have full permission, this is their delivery trajectory.
Okay, and it's on site now then in order to deliver completions from the next financial year?
Yes, they've just begun on site. Well, I went past about a month ago and it looks as though very early stages.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. Just a brief comment on the policy wording, and it's again, it's a familiar point. It's the issue of conserve and enhance, and just a reminder that any revised approach to that in relation to heritage matters should be applied to this part of the policy as well.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments on site DRA1 before we move on? Okay, in which case we'll move on to site lettered S in the MIQs, a local plan reference TRO1, which is land on Whitehorse Lane and to the rear of Charolais Close. I've probably got that wrong. Apologies. And Devon Way. Okay. The partnership's hearing statement breaks the site down into phase 1, which is currently under construction, phase 2, which is yet to commence. Does phase 2 now have a full planning permission in place?
Yes, it does. So it received full planning permission in December 2020, and work commenced on phase 2 in February 2021. And just for a little bit further information, sir, with phase 1, which is 98 dwellings, 58% are complete. So that's 57 occupied. Phase 2 is for 83 dwellings.
And phase 2, does that has full permission now, does it?
Yes, yes. Full plan permission was granted in December 2020.
Okay, fine. And is phase 2 under construction now?
Yes. Work commenced on phase 2 in February 2021.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. A couple of points on the site-specific policy. So we find it in the list. Okay. Apologies with butchering of the close. It looks like a French word. My French was never great. But
I'd say Charolais, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's probably far closer than I got. Okay. Couple of points. The introductory paragraph, the site promoter suggested that instead of being 9.37 hectares, it should be 16.2. Is the current hectareage correct, or does that need to be changed as a kind of factual correction?
I'm afraid I have to take that one away, sir, and check that.
If you wouldn't mind, it was the site promoter who made that point. And obviously, it's a statement of fact if it is or isn't correct.
Yes, I don't have the answer to that immediately. I need to check that. Let me just check in my notes. No, I don't have a note on that point, so we'll get onto that straight away. Okay.
Part 2 of the policy was the wording I preferred in terms of in relation to heritage assets, which is conserve and where opportunities arise, enhance. That's just a note for the partnership, really. There's the familiar issue of part 10 being a signpost to the minerals and waste coal strategy to be removed to the explanatory text. Another point suggested by the site promoter was that the explanatory text referred to a superseded planning application. I don't know if that's still the case. I believe it originally referred to a 2016 consent.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the supporting text, some of this is out of date, and we'll need some minor mods to amend that, just because of the passage of time. The second phase of development is pending completion of section 106, for example. That's out of date now.
Okay, if those could be covered as additional modifications, just as a factual update. Okay, are there any other comments on site TRO 1 before we move on? Okay, thank you. That concludes the sites on the urban fringe. So moving on to the sites in the key service centres.
So there'll be a change of guard here from this.
Okay, I'll just use the opportunity to refill my tumblers then.
Good morning, sir. I'm Samantha Jones, representative of the GNLP, and I will be speaking on behalf of the key service centres, and I'll be joined by my colleague, Phil Morris. Okay,
thank you. We'll start with site T on the MIQ list, local plan ref HEC1, land north of Heatherset. This is an existing allocation with a proposed uplift of 200 dwellings. How was the figure of 200 dwellings arrived at? And what was the reason for increasing this figure between Reg 18 and Reg 19 stages of the plan? Thank you.
The reason for the additional units is that the developers have used less land than originally anticipated to accommodate the permitted number of residential units.
Okay. So it's an analogous situation to Cringleford. Is that the case? Ms. Jones, you've frozen for me. I'm not sure if it's the problems at my end or at your end. Annette, can you assist?
Hi, it's with Sam Jones. She's working through on a different connection with the GNLP. So I'm going to ask maybe if she could move to a colleague's desk and work on a stronger link. I'm sure she's aware of this and is busily moving around the office. Let's see who else is still in the call. Here we go, Phil.
Yeah, it's just to say Sam is moving desks to try and get a better connection. Well, she's just freed up now, I think.
And I need to send my notes to myself.
Should we persevere with where we are, sir, because Sam has come back online now?
Yeah, we'll carry on. Really, I mean, it might just be a minor glitch. I
think this happened. Yeah, hopefully it happens once and then it won't happen again.
Okay. The question asked before I lost you, Ms. Jones, was about the situation being analogous to Cringleford. Is that the case, really, that the existing allocation's been constructed at a higher density than originally envisaged, such that it will leave a...
Yes, essentially, and there is no additional land for this allocation. It's a pure uplift across the existing HEP 1.
Okay. Just a quick point about the trajectory, because in the trajectory, the site's been disaggregated. And I wasn't clear reading through it on what basis that disaggregation had been done. Could the partnership explain when delivery from parts of the site without reserve matters consent is assumed? Because, like I say, I wasn't entirely clear looking at the trajectory what assumptions or what disaggregations had been applied. Thank you.
With regards to the breakdown across the years. My understanding is this is based on local developer knowledge of what's being produced elsewhere. For example, I think it was taken from the Sprowston. So where you see the breakdown of the 620 and the 210, that split is due to 2 different developers across the site. So that is why that figure is broken down. So those totals is what was achieved, what is left to achieve across the site. I do have an update in terms of where we are with completions on site as a total. There's 481 completions across the site.
Okay, and so those 2 sites you've drawn my attention to, both listed as North Village in the trajectory, those are basically 2 elements of this site controlled by 2 developers.
And there is the uplift is also separate to that in the trajectory.
And which site is that itemised as in the trajectory?
If you bear with me 1 second. So if you scroll down, it says HET 1 and it's references the GNLP 0177A. And that has got the 200 unit uplift allocated in there.
Okay, and that's forecasting this to deliver after the first phase have come forward. Okay, thank you. That's helpful clarification. I've got quite a number of detailed comments on the site-specific policy in this case. Just let me call that up. My version of the Part 2 plan. Okay, point of clarification to start with, really. My reading of this policy is that all of the requirements after the introductory paragraph, are they intended to apply just to the 200 home uplift?
Yeah, this policy is carried forward exactly as HET 1. So yes, in regards to the 200 addition, yes, they will apply to that.
because my reading of how it's been structured, so you've got the introduction to it on page 335 of the Part 2 sites plan, and obviously you've got the header at the top, which is emboldened and says what the site's envisaged to achieve. That's been updated to include the uplift. You've then got the introductory paragraph, and you've got the continued ... and on the next page it says the developer or developers of the additional 200 homes on the site will be required to ensure the following. So I read that as saying that basically the entirety of the second and third page, so that's 336 and 337, would apply just to the 200 uplift. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
Sorry, bear with me 1 second. I think my colleague Phil Morris just wants to make a point.
Okay. Mr. Morris.
Yes, sir. I'm afraid I'm not entirely sure that was our intention. It seems to me that the policy would still be applicable to the well, it would be applicable to the whole site and all the aspects of it that are undeveloped or don't have reserved matters. So I don't see how it would quite work if it only applied to the 200 homes.
Well, that was going to be a number of follow-up questions.
Sorry, I've only just picked that up. I can't see how that was our intention when the policy was redrafted from the original.
Okay.
So I think it's probably supposed to say that the following will also apply to the additional 200 homes, or words to that effect. I guess that was what was intended.
Okay, I mean, so has the policy in effect been rolled forward from the previous plan, largely as was? Is that the approach that's been taken?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, I do think there's a problem with that. As worded, it does read as if it's intended just to imply to the 200 homes. But even if that were rectified, I've got a few issues about, for example, master planning and phasing, particularly for a site that's largely under construction now, because the usual way you would require a comprehensive master plan is either in advance of or with the first application. Now, you've already got a site that is under construction. Myself and Mr. Warden saw this site. It's large areas of it have already been completed, and you can in fact see that from the aerial images as well. So how would you get a comprehensive master plan at this stage once large areas of the site are built out and large areas of it have reserved matters completions? It's not really clear that you could have a comprehensive master plan as things stand today. I would understand that approach if you were starting with a site where no development had commenced. Obviously, perhaps the policy was originally intended to apply in that context, but I'm not sure it really works in the same way when you have a site that's midway through construction as this one is. I mean, how could an uplift of 200 dwellings, let's say you get the residual part of the site, how could it provide a comprehensive master plan because large parts of the site will already have been developed?
Just in terms of the just thought a point to add the uplift allocation. I think in the statement of common ground it said the reserved matters had been submitted. It has actually been approved now, subject to section 106 agreements, and with that they had shown in accordance with the outline application with the master plan that covered the whole entire of the site, that the 200 uplift could be achieved indicatively in phase 4 of the outline scheme.
Okay, so the entire site now has reserved matters consent, including the 200 dwellings uplift.
There's a few areas that have reserved matters that are pending, but in relation to the uplift, that application was submitted and has been approved, subject to section 106 agreements.
Okay, it might then be that it's a slightly academic discussion, but I think the policy still needs to be sound to be adopted. Perhaps the best way for me to do this is if I list my concerns, and perhaps if you could go away and reflect on those and amend the policy as on the basis of that discussion. I'm happy to take comments as we go along. Obviously, if the concern about it being read as only applying to the 200 additional homes, and whilst obviously the partnership's clear in its own mind where those apply, if there's parts of the site that still don't have as reserve matters, presumably the 200 is anything over and above the original number that was allocated. So the 200, it's really the last 200 homes to get reserve matters, isn't it, in effect? So that's what the policy would apply to. But you've heard my thoughts on that. The issue is about comprehensive master planning. It might just be a tweak. It might just be to knit in with the existing site, or comprehensively master plan to take account of existing development, something like that. It can probably be addressed relatively straightforwardly. The enhanced facilities section, some of these concerns might fall away if the policy is rewritten to apply to the entire site. It was just obviously as whether 200 homes would trigger a requirement for all of those particular issues. If it's the wider site, obviously that's fine. With regards to 4 and 5 in particular. With regards to 6, again, you might be at the stage where the financial contribution's already been required, but I don't like the use of the word may require, because that implies it's, again, optional and nice to have. I think if that's necessary, it should be clearer that it is necessary. The landscaping and green infrastructure section. Minimise the impact on the strategic gap. Obviously, the strategic gap policies are set out, and that's part 7, are set out in lower order plans, but presumably they're spatial in nature. They're looking to achieve separation between settlements. They're akin to, they have a similar aim to Greenbelt policy, and therefore the allocation itself will be outside of the strategic gap and won't be part of it. So is what you're looking for there really about securing an appropriate landscaped edge to the development? Is that really what it is? And should it be phrased in landscape terms rather than in terms of the strategic gap, which is spatial in nature? It's about separation rather than character and appearance. Okay, I mean, but by all means, comment if you have a comment on the particular point. Otherwise, I'll keep going through and just itemising my issues really.
I just do have a comment. Sorry to interrupt. Just on the points 4 and 5, as they were considered by the case officer with regards to the uplift allocation, that he has stated in his report that this is in regards to point 4, which is to do with the open space. The application proposes public open space in accordance with the council's open space SPD. This has been calculated based on an assessment of the approved open space provision across the whole site, which has identified a surplus of open space when compared to the approved outline requirements. In terms of what additional open space is needed for the 200 uplift, to meet the SPD requirements, 2.32 hectares. To meet this need, they have proposed the following. There's a list that's conditioned, which relates to upgrading of the local equipped area of play in phase 4. They've also suggested or conditioned the creating of an older children's outdoor recreational trail in the strategic gap. So my understanding is these will be conditioned to meet the uplift of the 200 homes.
Okay, I mean, if the policy doesn't just apply to the uplift, then I don't have a problem with either 4 or 5. I think the concern with 5 in particular was that would just the 200 trigger a school expansion? So if the policy is reworded to apply to the entire site, I don't have any concerns with 4 or 5. Okay, I think point 10 is slightly, well, it's more than slightly vague at present. It's vague and unclear in a sense that maximise the benefit of green infrastructure provision, it's fine. And then avoid adverse impacts designated sites, linking ponds, watercourses and hedgerows. So that second sentence, it's not really clear what it means. It might just need some very minor tweaks to clarify. And there seems to be a word missing in there. Avoid adverse impacts to designated sites, presumably. But it's not clear how linking ponds, watercourses and hedgerows relates to that. It's pretty minor wording changes to make it clear. Section on transport. Again, a lot of my concerns probably related to the fact that I was interpreting the policy as purely applying to the 200 uplift. And so if it's applying to the whole site, if it applies to the whole site, I don't really have any concerns, certainly in regards to 13. Sorry, to 12. 13, there's the issue of, again, I mentioned before about requiring the agreement of the Highway Authority and Highways England. That needs to be deleted. There should be no reference, no policy should require the approval of a body such as the Highways Agency in order for it to be acceptable, for the reasons I outlined to Mr. Burrell. I think the rest of my concerns would fall away if the policy applies to the entire site. Couple of minor points in the final section. Again, there's the familiar point about the minerals and waste cost strategy policy being moved to the explanatory text. And again, the same point I made to Mr. Burrell in relation to the eastern site applies here to part 19. Again, part 19's almost worded like a pre-commencement condition. And I don't want to repeat myself. Exactly the same points I made to Mr. Burrell apply to that, and I'll ask the partnership to reflect on that point. Albeit it's academic here, given that the site already has planning permission, but again, that wording implies to me a bar on development unless that issue is addressed. Okay, any final comments on this site before we move on? Okay, we're approaching 11 o'clock, but the next couple of sites, I don't have anything to ask. I've got everything I need from the hearing statements on site local plan reference site BL01, which is you in the MIQs. Does anyone wish to comment on that site? Okay. I also have everything I need from the hearing statements with regards to ACL 1 in ACL, which is listed as site V in the MIQs. Are there any comments on that site before we move on? No. Okay. In which case, we've made relatively good progress this morning. It's just gone 11 o'clock. I'm going to propose we break till 11:30 and we'll come back and discuss site W, which is local plan reference RAP2 when we return. Okay, so the hearings are adjourned till 11:30. Thank you. Okay, it's now 11:30 and time to resume the hearings for the Greater Norwich local plan. Okay, before the break, we'd made good progress and we had worked our way through the sites with the key service centres. We'd reached site lettered W in the MIQs, which is local plan reference REP2, land at former station yard, Station Road, Reepham. Just to start with, it's been put to me by Mr. Ivins, who's unable to attend today, that the permission granted on this site for C2 uses is for C2 uses rather than the 20 homes envisaged by the policy. And in Mr. Ivins' view, that in effect means that another allocation is required in Reepham in order to accommodate those market and affordable dwellings envisaged by the policy. What's the partnership's response to that point, please? Thank you.
With regards to the numbers are strategic across the plan. So I don't think we would say that there is a shortfall of market within Reepham. Whilst we accept that the C3 use hasn't come forward as part of the allocation, the approved application for the 60-bed care home application, the case officer at the time considered that it was a desired need in the area for this use. So yes, we understand it hasn't come forward in the proposed allocation, but it was to meet a need for this care home at the time of the application.
Okay. I think, as I understood it, Mr. Ivins' point was less about the C2 use and more about the fact that it has taken an allocation which was envisaged for the kind of standard bricks and mortar housing, 20 homes, both market and affordable, which now won't be provided on this site. And in the partnership's view, does that mean that there is a need, in order to achieve the strategy for this site in the local plan, for another allocation to accommodate those homes, given they won't be accommodated on site RAP2?
No, we don't consider there to be a need to re-provide this in Reepham.
Okay, and what's the reason for that?
We have a 40 house uplift on the other allocation, so this is taken into consideration.
Okay. And so from your perspective, I suppose what the point is driving at, that Mr. Ivins is making, is that we had this in Hingham to an extent, where there was the site that was withdrawn for 20 houses, and it was put to the partnership that the loss of 20 houses on the site that was withdrawn, which from memory was 0503 to the northwest of Hingham, meant that there was a gap in the original number of allocated sites for that settlement. I guess there's some crossover here to that point, to the point made by Mr. Ivins. From your perspective, the strategy for the settlement is it affected by the development of this site for uses not envisaged by the policy?
No, it's not. It's not affected.
And why is that?
As mentioned, I think it was considered that the uplift in allocation for the Rep 1 site is covered, so we don't feel like there's a need to reallocate further housing in Reepham.
Okay, thank you. A quick point about the trajectory from myself. The site is assumed to deliver in 22-23, all 53 units. Is the site currently under construction in order to achieve that?
For the food store, that has been completed on site and has been operational now for some time. There is no reports of anything further being commencing on site. So with regards to the trajectory 53 to be completed in 22-23, we do accept that this is going to slip.
Okay, and do you have any specific information from the developer about when that might come forward?
No specific information on that, just in regards to the fact that the food store has been complete, and we would assume that the phasing of the bed care and assisted bungalows would come forward at a later stage. But no, we don't have any confirmation from the developer on this.
Okay, I think it needs to go back at least 1 year, potentially 2 in the trajectory. So if that can be reflected in any update that's provided, that would be appreciated. Thank you. Any other comments on site RAP2 before we move on? Okay, in which case we'll move on to site X in the MIQs, local plan reference ACL2, which is land south of Acle Station, between Reedham Road and New Reedham Road, Acle. Question for the partnership first. Delivery of this site is assumed in the current financial year. Is the site now largely completed?
The site has 9 completions recorded so far on site.
And when was that recording dated to?
That was a result was from last week. I'm aware that these are from CNC building control reports, so they are due final checks site to be complete by the end of this month. So that is 9 as of now.
Okay. If it's in the process of being constructed, then perhaps the residual part of the site, so it's down for 30 at present, perhaps 21 needs to go into the next financial year, because which is obviously nearly upon us. Yeah. Okay. Quick comment on the policy itself. So let me call it up on my screen. It's a point I've made in other sites really. In relation to part 2 of the policy, it says off-site improvements to the highway network may also be necessary. It's just that term may again implies nice to have rather than have to have or optional. So if I can ask and also there's the term as required by the highway authority, which needs to be removed. And again, it says potentially including pedestrian access. Presumably if this site has permission, then those things, a decision's been made on what is and what isn't required. There's been a full appraisal of the scheme by the highway authority. So perhaps that the wording just needs tightening up to be clear on what is required specifically.
Okay.
Other than that, I don't have any other comments on this site. Does anyone wish to comment on site ACL2 before we move on? Okay. In which case we'll move on to the village clusters. Starting with site Y, which is in the MIQ list. Local plan reference BL05, land to the north of Blowfield Corner, Blowfield Heath. Just call it up on my screen. Okay. Okay, the delivery of the first 18 homes at this site is assumed in the current financial year. Has that been achieved at this site? Thank you.
Hello, sir. Yeah, just to introduce myself, I'm Carol Baker, and I'll be dealing with the village cluster sites for the partnership. As mentioned in our response to the MIQs, the site does have consent. There's been applications for discharge of conditions. They've made a technical start on site and paid their initial instalments of their SIL charge, but there has been no completions currently on the site. So I think we would accept that the information in the trajectory of delivering 18 homes in 21-22 is not going to happen. So I would suggest that it probably needs to be pushed back a year. So having delivery in 22-23 and 23-24.
Okay, I mean, if there's a start being made on site and you've received SIL receipts, I think pushing back 1 year seems appropriate. Yeah. Okay. Are there any other comments on this site before we move on? I didn't have anything else I specifically wanted to ask. Okay. In which case we'll move on to site Z in the MIQ list, local plan ref HNF1, which is land east of Manor Road, Newton, St Faith. A similar question to the last site. Delivery of 30 homes is assumed in the current financial year. Has that been achieved?
I've had conversations with the monitoring officer at Broadland Council, and she's advised me that there are 20 completions recorded at the moment, but there will be further site visits undertaken at the end of this month, where she hopes that there will be some additional completions to add to that figure. So they are, continuing to build out on the site.
Okay, I mean the site's clearly under construction, has permission, and will all be within the 5-year supply. It's just if that could be updated to reflect the completions that have taken place when you get that information, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Yes, we can do that, sir.
Okay, a couple of detailed comments on the policy wording itself. Again, it's a similar point to one I mentioned a moment ago. Part 3. It's the wording that's unclear as to whether what is necessary and what isn't. And given that there's an approval on this site, that should presumably be known now by the Highway Authority, whereas it may not have been when the policy was first formulated. I don't like the use of the word may be necessary, because that again implies it's not a requirement. So if 3 could just be updated to reflect what has been required, and make that a clear requirement rather than something that's unclear whether it's required or not.
Yes, we can certainly do that, sir.
A similar point with regards to point 4, it's potential to include, again implies nice to have or encouraged or is optional. So if that's been required on site, then perhaps that should be a requirement of the policy rather than being worded in those terms. It's for clarity in effect.
Yeah, no problem. We can look at that, sir.
Okay, and the wider point I've made before about point 6 with regards to conserve and enhance. As I mentioned to Mr. Burrell, the wording from the Trouse policy is probably the best one I've seen. Okay. Any further comments on sites H and F1? Okay, in which case we'll move on to site AA in the MIQ list, local plan ref COL1, which is land at Rectory Road, Coltishall. Again, a trajectory question to start with. 30 homes are assumed in the new financial year starting at the end of this month. In order to achieve that, is the site currently under construction?
No, the site is not currently under construction. I think, as we discussed last week in relation to the adjacent site, it's had resolution to approve at committee in January. So there's no construction on site currently. So I think we would accept that the trajectory may be optimistic.
I mean, it's obviously an advanced stage, perhaps a splitting. I mean, the issue when you have a number like that, which is what you might assume would deliver in a full year, in a financial year, is it implies that you'll be starting to deliver completions from on or close to the 1st of April. Perhaps maybe splitting it between that financial year and the following financial year would be more accurate, whether that's 10 in the first and 20 in the second, or in either, it would still be within the 5-year supply, but just reflecting the situation that's transpired since. And obviously, as discussed during the session last week, there's a need to merge this allocation with GNLP 2019.
Yeah, we're happy to make all those changes, sir.
Okay. Any further comments on this site before we move on? Okay, in which case we move on to site BB, as in the MIQ list, local plan ref SWA1, which is land to the rear of Birmingham Road and St Mary's Close, South Walsham. We did have a discussion about this site last week in relation to the proposed extension to the allocation, and obviously the need to merge this site with GNLP 0382. During the discussion last week, the Highway Authority said they hadn't had the opportunity to review the evidence that had been put forward by the site promoter at Reg 19 stage, which was a relatively short transport note, and it showed how a junction onto, I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong here, but Shamrock Hall Lane could be achieved with visibility displays of 160 metres in each direction. Have the Highway Authority had a chance to review that evidence now and come to a view on the appropriateness of the policy wording and the requirement that access only be taken from the alternative point?
I've had an email from my highways colleagues, and they said they have had an initial look at the highway report, and that email states that they wish to reassert their view that the site should be allocated via the existing allocation or Birmingham Road. I'm afraid I haven't had the opportunity to have any further discussions directly with them, but obviously we will have further discussions doing our sort of proposing our modifications to the policy.
What's the reason for that? Is there any reason given?
They didn't give me any reason. As I say, I'm afraid with the hearing sessions, I haven't had an opportunity to discuss it directly with them, but obviously I can do that, and we could report back to you on that matter.
And is Mr. It was Mr. Wilson, wasn't it, from the Highway Authority? Is he? It doesn't seem to be within the call. Is he not available to comment today?
Yeah, they're not in the call today, unfortunately. No.
Okay. Ms. Razek, did you wish to come in?
Hello, thank you. Yes, really just to reiterate the points from the other day, obviously we do think that access from Chamery Hall Lane is achievable. Also on the call today is our highway consultant, so if you have any specific questions for him, then he's here and able to answer those. I mean, we have, as I said before, provided an independent road safety audit, which does demonstrate that access is acceptably achievable there. So it would be interested to know what Norfolk County Council's reasons for requiring it from Birmingham Road are. Luke, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Hi there. Yes, we were commissioned by the client to review access on Chamery Hall Lane. We provided a site access sketch in accordance with Norfolk's design standards. An ATC, a traffic survey, was undertaken on Chamery Hall Lane to establish what the design speeds were, to which we provided suitable visibility displays. Radii and carriageway widths were all provided. That was then subject to a stage 1 safety audit by an independent third party, which verified that that was appropriate. The other aspect that we looked at was obviously pedestrian connectivity into the village. That can be provided via new footways onto Birmingham Road. So as I think Becky sort of alluded to there, we're a little bit at a loss as to why Norfolk County Council is still reiterating their point for access onto Birmingham Road when a suitable access, we believe, can be provided on Chamery Hall Lane to the south.
Ms. Baker, your hand's raised.
Yes, thank you, sir. I've just called up the email that I received from David Wilson and scrolled down a little bit, and there is some further information from Norfolk County Council Highways. He's asked some of his colleagues to have a look at that report. And obviously, I'm no highways expert, but I could read out what the information that's in that email. Basically, it says that the safety audit report is just considering whether the required visibility can be achieved. It is not considering the principle of a new junction onto the section of B-class road subject to the national speed limit. It is our view that the increased conflict caused by slowing, stopping and turning movements at a new junction would be detrimental to highway safety, especially when there is an alternative to access the development by the existing allocation to the north.
Okay.
Would you like me to respond, or?
Yeah, could you just assist with pronouncing your surname in the first instance? Apologies.
Farrell, no problem.
Farrell, okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Farrell, if you could respond to that point, it'd be helpful. Thank you.
Of course. It's this is a point which they raise typically onto A roads, the principal routes within the county, where they do not wish to restrict movement on principal routes of movement, i.e. for right turners into the site. This isn't something that we've come across previously on B roads such as this. If they're saying that, then they are saying that no new accesses should be provided off of B roads or C roads in the county. So all new accesses will obviously result in an element of new turning movements. We don't consider that in this location that it's inappropriate, and that if a junction could be provided that accords with their design guide, which this does, I say again that we're a bit confused as to why they are objecting in principle when they haven't actually provided any design or highway safety reasons why this is inappropriate in their mind in this location. It seems to be more a case of their opinion rather than any facts in terms of safety. We've also looked at the safety record in this location. There's no history of accidents in this location, so we're struggling a little bit with this one.
Ms. Baker, you rattled through that email relatively quickly, and being a humble town planner rather than a highways engineer, I'd probably appreciate a second read through if that's okay. If you could just read it out one more time for my benefit, please.
Yes, of course, sir. It says the safety audit report is just considering whether the required visibility can be achieved. It is not considering the principle of a new junction onto a section of B-class road subject to the national speed limit. It is our view that the increased conflict caused by slowing, stopping and turning movements at a new junction would be detrimental to highway safety, especially when there is an alternative to access the development by the existing allocation to the north.
It'd be helpful for me to understand from the site promoter's perspective what the concern is about requiring access from Birmingham Road. Does that create problems for the delivery of the site?
Not necessarily. We wanted to have the flexibility to have an access from both ends or either end. It's too early a stage, really, in our view, to determine where the access should come from now. That ought to be something that can be negotiated through the planning application process. So we wanted the flexibility within the policy wording to allow that.
And is the proposed access from Birmingham Road, is that within your control or is that in a separate ownership?
It is within our control.
Okay. So if the access is required from that end of the site, it doesn't in any way undermine the ability of the site to come forward. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Mr. Farrell, you said it's an issue you've come across on A roads, the point that the Highway Authority has raised. The point about conflict between slowing, stopping and turning vehicles with high-speed traffic. Why would that point only be pertinent to A roads rather than more busy, for example, B roads?
The reason being is that they are corridors of movement to facilitate vehicles travelling from point A to point B, for example, from one town to another. And the perception of those routes are that they are fast-moving, high volume of traffic routes that should not be, those routes of traffic should not, or flows of traffic should not be impeded. And again, that's their principle, that's their consideration, their thoughts. There are no hard and fast facts of that, but that's a point we found with other clients and other sites on those particular routes, not on B roads such as this, in locations such as this. The safety audit was undertaken to review the design, and as part of that, they review the visibility, pedestrian connectivity, the safety record, the proposals in terms of traffic generation, that kind of thing. And in their mind, the conclusion of that safety audit was that the design of the access was appropriate in this location, subject to the relocation or the closing of the lay-by to the west of the site. But that was the only comment that we received. So the safety audit is typically undertaken to support an access proposal in any location as part of a planning application. The client's gone above and beyond in this instance to try and demonstrate that access can be achieved onto Shamrock Hall Lane that accords with Norfolk's design guide, and we believe that it does. And to this day, that Norfolk have never quoted any reason other than they do not wish to see access onto Shamrock Hall Lane.
I have to say, Ms. Baker, it does put me in a slightly difficult position when there isn't someone from the Highway Authority here, and when there was someone from the Highway Authority, they hadn't appraised themselves of the evidence that had been put forward by the site promoter. So I don't really have the county's position other than an email you've read out. We did mention a brief note, and I think given that this is the point of contention on this site, it's the point of contention really. Everything else is more or less it's not in dispute between anyone really. I think a note on these points would be helpful, setting out why the highway authority consider this to be a safety issue. It seems that the concerns don't relate to visibility displays. It's that appropriate visibility can be achieved in both directions for anyone emerging from this junction. It seems to, from the email you've read out, relate to conflicts between the high-speed traffic along this road and vehicles emerging from or moving into the junction itself. Why is that a particular concern here is what I need to know. And myself and Mr. Warden can drive along it, we can see it for ourselves. But why is that a safety concern? Is it just that they would prefer the Birmingham Road site, or is it that safety considerations would preclude this access, sorry, the Birmingham Road access? I think that's the key distinction here. Mr. Farrell, would you like to comment?
Thank you. Yes, the speed survey that was undertaken demonstrated that vehicular speeds are travelling less than the speed limit, and also that the data received shows that traffic flows in Shamrock Hill Lane are relatively low, as you'd expect in a rural location such as this. And also, obviously, the development proposals aren't of a huge size, so therefore the amount of traffic turning into and out of the site is likely to be relatively small. So that's just my thoughts in relation to those comments you raised there. But yes, it would be very interesting to, if Norfolk Highways were actually able to provide some sort of to substantiate their comments there, we could enter dialogue with them.
Okay.
Thank you.
A short note, Ms. Baker, I think would assist me. I don't want it being more than a page. I want it in bullet point form. It doesn't need any context or introduction. I've read the appellants. That's an appellant. Not a Section 78 hearing today. I've been in plenty of those in the past. From the site promoter's perspective, I've read their evidence. You've heard my questions. Obviously, you've got the recording of the session. I think those are the questions I want an answer for. What precisely is the safety concern? And is this a question of preference between two proposed potential accesses rather than one being safe and one being unsafe?
Yes,
like I say,
certainly,
it needs to just be very focused bullet point note of no more than a page. That would help me. Thank you. Okay. Are there any other comments on this site before we move on from any party? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Which brings us on to the final site, which is CC in the MIQ list and local plan reference FRE1, land north of Palmer's Lane, Freethorpe. I understand this site has now largely been built out. I've got everything I need from the hearing statements, to be honest, so there's no further questions from my perspective. Are there any further questions from around the room? Okay. In which case we've concluded matter 12 and we've done so in relatively good time. Okay. I think with regards to this afternoon's session, Annette, is there any scope to bring that forward to 1:30, seeing as we're going to be breaking for lunch at 12?
I will endeavour to do that. There's, as you're aware, Inspector, a great number of participants in for that session, and they all have the invite time for 2 o'clock. So I can't guarantee that everyone would be able to join us. So I'm not sure how you feel. I'd be willing to try, obviously.
Yeah, I see the point, particularly when there's a large number of attendees. Let's stick to 2 o'clock then if it's going to create problems. Half an hour is unlikely to be here, neither here nor there at the end of the day. Okay. In which case we'll take a longer lunch, a well-deserved longer break for all concerned, and we'll return for this afternoon's session, which is matter 15 at 2 o'clock. Okay, thank you all for your contributions. The hearing is now adjourned. Thank you.